Before we jump into today's story, drop a quick comment to say hi, tell me your name, where you're watching from, and let me know if you're sticking around till the end. Don't forget to hit that subscribe button, give this video a thumbs up, and share it with your friends. Alright, let's get into the story. I never thought betrayal could come from my own blood. People warn you about neighbors, friends, even spouses turning into strangers, but few ever whisper about the deep heartbreak a child can bring to his mother. Yet here I am, telling you this story from my old rocking chair in Kentucky, sipping on lukewarm coffee, eyes clouded by years of both love and loneliness. Friends, you enjoy listening to stories, but you don't subscribe to the channel or like the videos. I request you to please subscribe to the channel right now so that I get more motivation to bring you even more stories. If you help me reach 1,000 subscribers, I promise to bring you extremely best stories with a truly real feel, so go ahead, like the video, subscribe to the channel, and now let's move on to today's story. It all started on a warm June morning in Louisville when I found out that my only son, Christopher, had spent nearly $250,000 on an anniversary party. Not for me, not for his late father, but for his wife's parents, people I never got along with. And the worst part? He had completely forgotten my birthday, which was just 3 days earlier. I don't think I've ever felt that kind of hollowing ache before. Birthdays aren't about the gifts at my age, they're about acknowledgement, about gratitude for the woman who carried him, nurtured him, sacrificed everything so that he could stand tall in this world. That day, I felt invisible, erased, like I was nothing more than a footnote in his busy, glittering life. But let me tell you something. I may be a 70-year-old widow, with creaky knees and a back that complains whenever I rise from the chair, but time has not aged my resolve. When one has been ignored, humiliated, and placed second to strangers, a heart starts to brew something darker. It's not anger alone. It's revenge, not of the impulsive, violent kind, but the cold, careful, calculating sort. And that's where my story begins. I was born in the 1950s in Tennessee, the daughter of a factory worker and a homemaker. Ours was a life shaped by discipline, faith, and a sense of duty. By the time I moved to Kentucky, working double shifts at a diner to pay for college, I had already decided that family would always come first. That belief carried me through my marriage to Walter, Christopher's father. Walter wasn't a perfect man, but he was honorable, steady, and dependable in ways that mattered most. Together, we built a modest house, filled it with laughter, and poured every ounce of love into raising Christopher. I worked 3 jobs when he was younger, just so he could attend a private school. Vacations were a luxury we couldn't afford, but every Christmas I tried to make magical. I learned how to sew costumes for school plays, how to bake birthday cakes shaped like dinosaurs and superheroes, all because I wanted him to have everything I never did. Quite simply, I lived for him. But sometimes, pouring yourself entirely into another human being only leaves you empty when they fail to return even a fraction of the devotion. Christopher went off to college in New York and returned home changed. He had girlfriends before, but none captured him like Meredith did. Meredith was polished, ambitious, and charming if you didn't look too closely beneath the surface. To me, she always carried the energy of someone with sharp edges hidden behind a constant smile. Her parents, Richard and Elaine, were even worse. They had wealth, and more importantly, the sort of arrogance that came with it. From the very first Thanksgiving together, Elaine made subtle jabs about my cooking, my clothes, even my accent. Richard barely acknowledged me at all, as though I were part of the furniture. But Christopher loved Meredith, and as mothers often do, I swallowed my pride. I embraced them to whatever extent I could. I smiled when Meredith planned the wedding in New York with no thought of Kentucky traditions. I tolerated Richard's condescending remarks about working-class simplicity. I even bit my tongue when Elaine suggested Christopher should change his last name because Miller sounded too plain. All for my son. What I didn't realize back then was that every little concession I made widened the distance between me and Christopher. Each act of endurance taught him that I could be taken for granted. Last year, when I turned 70, I expected at least a phone call. At least. I don't ask for diamonds or 5-star dinners. A happy birthday, Mom. I love you. That's all I wanted. Instead, silence filled my day. When I finally saw Christopher 2 weeks later, he shrugged and said he'd been busy. Busy arranging his in-laws' anniversary bash. Later, I saw the pictures online. A lavish ballroom rented out in Manhattan. A string quartet. Champagne that flowed like water. A customized sculpture shaped like a swan. And the bill? Over $250,000. My son spent all that money making 2 people who always resented me feel like royalty, while I sat home alone that same week with a slice of store-bought cake I bought for myself. That was the exact moment something inside me shattered. And from those shards, something sharp was born. Revenge isn't always fire and fury. Sometimes it's quiet, like roots spreading under the soil. I knew I didn't want to harm him physically, but I needed him to feel the depth of betrayal he had dealt me. And I wanted Meredith, Elaine, and Richard to know that their smug dynasty could crumble at the touch of an old woman scorned. The plan started small, spending more time at the local community center, getting to know lawyers, financial advisors, estate planners. I learned things most widows don't bother learning: how wills can be rewritten, how properties can be shifted, how trusts can be manipulated in silence. They assumed I'd leave everything to Christopher without a second thought. That assumption would be their undoing. Because when the time came, I would not only reclaim my dignity but also ensure that Christopher understood the value of what he had discarded, me. After my son's betrayal sank in, I spent weeks drifting in and out of bitterness. Some days I cried into my pillow, muffling my sobs so the neighbors wouldn't hear. Other days I stared at old photo albums, recalling the little boy who once clung to my legs, who once begged me to read him the same bedtime story again and again. Where had that innocent child gone? How had he grown into the man who would lavish strangers with gifts while neglecting his own mother? It would have been easy to stay broken, to simply let time numb the pain. But somewhere in the solitude of my house, as dust gathered on forgotten corners, my pain transfigured into fuel. That's when I began observing. You see, in small communities like ours in Kentucky, people talk. All I had to do was listen, really listen, to gather pieces of information that most overlook. Meredith's parents might have looked like royalty in their world, but scratch the surface and their foundation wasn't as stable as they wanted others to believe. I first learned about Richard's gambling habits at the library. A volunteer from a local charity whispered that he'd seen Richard slipping cash to a bookie in Louisville. The man was losing money fast. Elaine, meanwhile, had several cosmetic surgery appointments billed quietly under shell accounts. Appearances came first for them, always, but appearances can crumble when money runs out. Meredith, my daughter-in-law, had similar cracks. For all her polished confidence, she confided in a mutual acquaintance that she worried about her fertility. She and Christopher had been trying for years, but no baby, not yet. In wealthy circles, appearances of a perfect family mattered almost as much as yachts and summer homes. I realized Meredith clung to my son not just out of love, but out of necessity. He was her anchor, her proof that she had everything. These cracks were not yet fractures, but I knew how to widen them if needed. Before planning revenge, I had to strengthen myself first. I began attending free workshops offered by the community college, real estate law, estate management, even beginners courses in cybersecurity. The students were half my age, but I took notes furiously, asking questions until the professors grew to respect me. I started visiting lawyers, subtle as a shadow, gathering information about how to protect assets and manipulate expectations. I wasn't rich like Richard and Elaine, but Walter and I had worked hard. Our small but well-kept house, Walter's life insurance, some rental land we had invested in decades ago, all of it gave me an estimated estate of nearly $750,000. Modest compared to their empire, perhaps, but enough to matter. And they all assumed Christopher would inherit it one day. What they didn't know, I had already begun rewriting my will. The first step of revenge is doubt. I started dropping hints during phone calls with Christopher. "Sweetheart," I'd say softly, I was talking to some friends at the community center. "Did you know children sometimes sue when they feel their inheritance was mishandled? Isn't that wild?" He would laugh and brush it off, but I could hear hesitation in his voice. By the third time I brought it up, he asked directly, "Mom, you're not changing your will, are you?" I pretended to be confused. "Oh, darling, why would you think that?" But the doubt lingered. And while he stewed on it, I made quiet alterations with my attorney. My estate would no longer pass directly to Christopher. Instead, it would go into a trust, one that released assets based on conditions of loyalty. Several months after my forgotten birthday, Christopher invited me reluctantly to another family gathering. This time, rather than celebrating his in-laws, it was a casual dinner at his New York apartment. When I arrived, I noticed something immediately: the strain. Meredith's smile was tight, and Christopher looked drained. The glamorous glow of the anniversary bash had faded. From stray comments at the table, I pieced together that the $250,000 celebration had stretched them, not just financially but emotionally. Richard had pressured Christopher into footing more than half the bill, under the guise of honoring family. My son had been manipulated, yet he still defended them. Meanwhile, no one at that table even mentioned my birthday. That night, I left earlier than expected, pulling my coat closer against the bite of the Manhattan wind. As I rode back to my modest hotel outside the city, my thoughts hardened like winter ice. They would all learn that dismissing me came at a cost. And sooner rather than later. My opportunity came when Elaine, of all people, accidentally invited me to a charity gala in Louisville. She had been rattling off invitation lists during a phone call while I sat silently in the corner during a visit. She then turned and said sweetly, "I suppose you'd come too, won't you, dear? Everyone respectable will be there." Respectable. As though I'd ever need her validation. But I played along. At the gala, I dressed in maroon silk that Walter had bought me decades ago, and I carried myself like someone with nothing to prove. I mingled with lawyers, bankers, and investors. To my quiet joy, one young investment advisor took the time to explain the basics of anonymous charitable endowments. I realized I could shift my money where nobody could trace it easily. Not Christopher. Not Meredith. Certainly not Richard and Elaine. The trap was set. Now all I needed was time, patience, and precision. I never rushed. That's one of the great advantages of age: patience. The young hunger for instant results. People my age know that revenge, like a stew, needs time to simmer before it takes on its richest flavor. After the gala, I began shuffling small amounts of my assets. At first, just enough to test the waters: $5,000 here into a charitable trust, $10,000 there into a scholarship fund for single mothers. It was a double win. I gained goodwill in my community while learning how to hide my hand. Eventually, I shifted larger amounts until nearly half my estate was quietly protected under charities, anonymous trusts, and endowments. To the outside world, it looked like I was just being generous, leaving a legacy for Kentucky families. But underneath, it was part of the trap. By the time anyone tried to claim my estate, they'd discover it wasn't theirs to take. But I didn't stop at financial warfare. I needed to know how far Christopher had fallen under his in-law's shadow. So I tested him. One evening, I called and said, "Son, could you come and help me fix the fence out back? It's falling apart, and my back isn't what it used to be." There was a long silence before he replied. "Mom, things are hectic right now. We've got a dinner with Meredith's parents this weekend. Maybe hire a handyman? I swallowed my disappointment. I see. That small conversation broke something final inside me. A good son, raised on the sweat of his parents' labor, would never dismiss such a request. It wasn't about the fence, it was about whether I still mattered. Clearly, to him, I didn't. But he didn't realize I was measuring his loyalty in preparation for the storm I was about to unleash. Old women like me are easy to ignore, yet we make the best spies. I'd sit quietly at community events, at church potlucks, even on the benches outside the cafe, listening, smiling, nodding at chatter. And when the time was right, I'd drop a whisper. "Oh, dear," I told one curious neighbor, "I can't decide whether to leave the estate to Christopher or just donate it all. He does seem happier with Meredith's family than with me." That whisper traveled faster than wildfire. Within a month, word reached Christopher's ear that I might change everything. He called me, his voice suddenly anxious. "Mom," he said carefully, "people are saying things. That you might not be leaving me the house? I mean, you wouldn't actually do that, right?" "Oh, Christopher," I said softly, letting silence do most of the work. "People talk, you know. Don't worry so much." The panic in his voice afterward almost made me smile. Almost. Around this time, I began to notice subtle but visible cracks forming in the perfect image of Meredith's parents. Richard was drinking more heavily at social gatherings. Elaine had a face stretched tight with the latest cosmetic work, but her eyes betrayed fear. I heard through a mutual acquaintance at church that Richard had taken out loans, big ones. His gambling had gone deeper than I thought, and while he tried to mask it, his empire was wobbling. Elaine still put on her airs, insisting on galas and charity events, but it was only a matter of time before those cracks split wide open. I didn't even have to touch them. Their downfall was already brewing. But I would help gravity along. I began documenting everything I learned. The gambling debts, the surgeries, even whispers of Richard's possible affairs. Not through gossip, but through concrete leads. Public records, overheard conversations, little breadcrumbs on financial documents Meredith once carelessly left in my sight. I tucked away copies, neatly stored in a safety deposit box under my control. Insurance not for me, but for their undoing. Why? Because revenge is not always about direct strikes. Sometimes, it's about letting your enemies self-destruct while you hold the detonator. And where was my son in all this? Right in the center, blind to it all. He called less and less as he grew more entrenched in their world. Meredith whispered in his ear, convincing him that her parents were more important connections, more worthy of his devotion. He didn't even see the strings attached to him. He thought he was in control, the doting husband keeping his wife happy. But really, he was a pawn. They fed him validation while draining his money and loyalty. And when the pawn grows too weak, the game ends badly. That was his path. But I was about to place myself on the board too, not as a pawn, not even as a queen, but as the player who tilts the entire game over. By the time autumn arrived, I had everything in place. Most of my estate hidden in trusts and charities. Legal documents ensuring Christopher couldn't touch a penny without proving his loyalty. Ammunition against Richard and Elaine, tucked safely away. A reputation in my community as a sweet, generous widow. They thought I was weak. They thought I was invisible. But I had set my pieces. The game was ready. All that remained was to watch them stumble, then strike when the moment was perfect. Winter came sharp and merciless that year, and with it came the first tremors of collapse. Richard's debts finally caught up to him. Word spread in hushed tones at church luncheons and grocery aisles. His company had defaulted on a major loan. Men in suits were arriving at his office more often than clients. Elaine, meanwhile, doubled her attendance at charity luncheons, pretending everything was fine, but beneath that mask, her smile was tight, brittle as glass. I knew all of this without lifting a finger. That's the thing about revenge, sometimes, all you have to do is step aside and let gravity do its work. But watching wasn't enough, I wanted Christopher to feel it. To realize the people he had prioritized over me were crumbling towers built on sand. He called one evening, his voice strained, thin. "Mom, things are getting complicated with Meredith's family. They're going through some tough financial times, but we're helping them. You know, it's the right thing to do." My lips curled into a bitter smile. "Of course, son. Family always comes first, doesn't it?" He hesitated at that, recognizing the barb. But he didn't acknowledge it. Instead, he muttered something about a fundraiser they were planning, a fundraiser, when they were already drowning in debt. His blind devotion stunned me. I didn't argue. I didn't need to. The more he gave them, the more they'd consume him whole. And when he was hollowed out, I would be there, not to save him, but to show him what I had been all along, the one person he discarded yet could never replace. That winter, I began gently pressing at the cracks. Nothing dramatic, nothing loud, just whispers where they'd cut the sharpest. At a local Christmas charity event, I leaned toward a banker's wife I knew and murmured, "Such a shame about Richard and Elaine. Did you hear they took loans against the estate? So sad, especially after such a grand anniversary party." I didn't have to say more. Whispers spread on their own, especially among the wealthy elite who pretended loyalty but savored scandal like wine. Within weeks, the gossip became impossible for Elaine to squash. Invitations to exclusive gatherings thinned. Investments dried up. And through it all, Christopher worked like a man chained, funneling more of his earnings into keeping their world afloat. Spring came, and with it, my 71st birthday. By then, enough had cracked between them that I decided to test my son one last time. I didn't call him. I didn't drop reminders. I waited. Day 1 passed, silence. Day 2, still nothing. By day 3, my phone finally rang. Christopher, voice hurried, almost panicked. "Happy birthday, Mom. I'm so sorry, I've been swamped. We were dealing with..." I cut him off. My voice calm but like ice. "You spent $250,000 on people who aren't even your blood, and you couldn't remember my birthday until 3 days later." Again. Silence. He tried sputtering excuses, but I ended the call before he could finish. For the first time, I think he felt the weight of guilt. But it was too late. 2 weeks later, I filed the final version of my will. Legally binding, airtight. My estate now funneled almost entirely into scholarships, community centers, and trusts for children who had nobody. Not a cent guaranteed for Christopher. But the brilliance was in how I structured it. Every clause allowed him to prove himself over time, to earn back pieces by demonstrating genuine loyalty. Help me in my old age? A share would unlock. Choose me over Meredith's family when duty called? Another part would come. But only if he made the right choices. If he didn't, well, then strangers and orphans would inherit everything I worked for, not the ungrateful son who forgot me. By early summer, their empire had collapsed completely. Richard's gambling debts forced the sale of their summer home in the Hamptons. Elaine, stripped of her preferred spotlight, became reclusive, her vanity surgeries standing out now as grotesque reminders of a lost image. And Christopher? He stood in the middle, drained, trying to hold on to a world that was never his to begin with. He called less and less, his pride keeping him from admitting the truth of their downfall. But I saw it play out from afar, piece by piece, smile by smile. all while my plan sat neatly in its box, ready to be revealed when the timing was perfect. The revenge was no longer just about money or inheritance. It was about recognition. About making him, Meredith, and especially Richard and Elaine realize that dismissing me had consequences. That the woman they thought was powerless was, in fact, the architect of their unraveling. The time to reveal the truth was drawing near. And when I finally did, none of them would walk away unchanged. By midsummer, every piece was firmly in my control. I had my will locked up, trusts feeding into charities, and documentation tucked safely away in that little safety deposit box. Still, revenge is most satisfying when the blade is revealed slowly, so they feel the terror of what's coming before it lands. I decided that the time had come to gather them all under one roof. Not theirs, mine. Christopher rarely visited anymore, but when I called and said I wanted to host a small family dinner in Kentucky, he reluctantly agreed. Meredith, of course, insisted on coming. And, just as I anticipated, she invited her parents along too. For them, it was a chance to parade their prestige one last time in front of me, the country bumpkin mother-in-law they had always patronized. But for me, it was the stage. I set the table with Walter's old china and lit candles, though the air outside was heavy with heat. Richard swaggered in, hiding his ruin behind cheap charm. Elaine arrived with her smile stretched taut, her pearls gleaming under the chandelier. Meredith swept in like she owned the room, while my son trailed, looking older than his years, dark circles under his trusting eyes. We ate politely, exchanging shallow conversation. I watched them all closely, letting silence do most of the work. Then, as dessert was set on the table, a simple peach cobbler, homemade, I cleared my throat. There's something I've been meaning to share with you all, I began, my voice calm, edges sharp as glass. They looked up, forks midair. I've finalized my will. Chairs shifted. Richard froze, Meredith leaned forward, Christopher blinked quickly. And, I continued, I thought it best that you all knew before the Lord decides it's my time. I explained in the same flat, steady tone how my estate would no longer pass directly to Christopher. I told them about the trusts, about the scholarships, about the charitable funds for children in need. I watched their mouths tighten, their color drain, as realization settled over them. But then came the final twist. There are conditions, I added. Loyalty conditions. Christopher has the chance to reclaim what should have been his, but only if he prioritizes his own blood above all else. If he doesn't, then every cent will go to strangers. A thick silence filled the room. Richard shifted uncomfortably. Elaine pressed her lips so tight they nearly disappeared. Meredith's eyes flashed with fury. And Christopher, poor, bewildered Christopher, looked at me with something between shame and disbelief. Mom, how could you do this? He whispered. How could you? I replied, meeting his gaze. You spent a fortune honoring the people at this table, I gestured to the in-laws, but you forgot my birthday. Twice. You forgot the woman who bled, who sacrificed, who worked 3 jobs to put you where you are. And for what? To please those who would discard you the second you run dry. That was when Richard snapped. The mask of cool superiority cracked, and out came the venom. She's manipulating you, Christopher. This is her bitterness talking. That's enough, I cut in sharply. Don't you dare talk about manipulation when you've been leeching off my son for years. Your debts, your fake grandeur, your threats of shame, what do you call that, if not manipulation? Elaine paled, her polished composure unraveling as I laid bare their secrets. And Elaine, all those rumors you desperately tried to squash, those loans no one was supposed to know about? Don't act shocked. The world already talks. Meredith slammed her hand on the table. You hateful woman. You don't get to tear my family apart. But her anger only tightened the noose. Christopher turned toward her, his face finally dawning with realization she hadn't denied anything. For the first time, my son's eyes flickered between them and me with doubt. Thick, painful, paralyzing doubt. Is it true? He asked Meredith through clenched teeth. Have you been hiding this from me? It's not what it looks like, she snapped. The classic defense of liars everywhere. But Christopher wasn't stupid, only blind up till now. He pushed his chair back, the weight of years crashing over him. He rubbed his face, his voice broken when he finally spoke again. And all this time, I believed you. I believed them. And I forgot her. His eyes met mine. No arrogance, no distance, just a small boy's guilt behind a grown man's lines. I forgot you, Mom. I didn't smile. Revenge isn't about gloating, it's about justice. I sat straighter, my tone steady. I don't need your apology, Christopher. I don't need your excuses. What I need is proof, in your actions, not your words. My estate, my legacy, it won't fall into your lap. Not anymore. You'll have to fight for it. By fighting for me. The in-laws stared at me in stunned silence, stripped of their armor. For the first time in perhaps years, they looked small. And as for Meredith, her fury burned, but I could see the terror behind it. She realized in that instant that her grip on my son, and on his future, was slipping. After they left that night, slamming doors and muttering curses, Christopher lingered. His gaze was softer now, broken, conflicted. I don't know if I can undo all of this, he whispered. I touched his shoulder, firm but cool. Then start small. Remember your real family. The rest will follow, or it won't. It's on you now. He left with his head heavy. And for the first time in a long while, I sat at my empty table not in sorrow, but in peace. Because I had done it. I had reclaimed my dignity. And no matter how the rest unfolded, whether he proved himself again or crumbled with his in-laws, the power was finally, firmly, mine. It has been 5 years since that dinner. 5 long years since I turned the tables on them all and forced Christopher to choose between the life he'd been puppeteered into and the blood that had given him life in the first place. Did he change? Did he step up? The truth isn't simple, not like fairy tales would have you believe. That night broke something between Christopher and Meredith. Though they didn't divorce immediately, their marriage cracked at the foundation. My words had stripped Meredith bare, and Christopher could never unsee the truth. Her loyalty was to her parents, not him. Within a year, the strain grew unbearable. Meredith filed for separation after Christopher refused to keep sinking his income into her parents' failing empire. As for Richard and Elaine, their downfall was swift and brutal. Richard's debts pulled them into lawsuits, and within 2 years, they'd lost nearly everything. Their Hamptons house was foreclosed, Elaine's reputation disintegrated, and the same social circles that once adored them now whispered behind their backs. They live quietly now, shadows of their former grandeur. I rarely hear of them, and when I do, it's only gossip about how far they've fallen. Christopher came back to Kentucky more often after Meredith left. Not at first, he was too humbled, too consumed by shame. But slowly, each visit grew more earnest. He helped mend that fence I'd once asked about. He drove me to doctor's appointments without being asked. He spent less time on gifts and more time simply sitting with me, talking like the boy I once remembered. Was it enough to rewrite the years of neglect? No. Some wounds leave scars even after they've healed. But I saw him trying, day by day. And though I never told him outright, that was all I ever wanted, to matter. To be remembered. 3 years after that fateful dinner, I adjusted my will one final time. I did not undo the charities. It was important to me that other children abandoned or neglected, gain something from what I had built. But I introduced a new clause: a share would go to Christopher outright, acknowledgement of his efforts since. Not everything, no. That would have been erasure of the lesson he needed. But enough. Enough to remind him that loyalty, delayed but returned, still has worth. Some would call me cruel, playing such a long game against my own child. But I don't see it that way. Revenge wasn't about destroying him, it was about opening his eyes. Making him look at the damage he had caused me by choosing others, by forgetting the mother who gave him everything. The in-laws? They collapsed on their own. Meredith? She revealed her true colors. Christopher? He finally came home, in the truest sense of the word. And me? I finally found peace in knowing that I was not invisible, not erased. My absence carved a hole deep enough in him that he had to confront it. My presence became undeniable again, not through pleading, but through power. Now, as I sit by the window in my old house in Kentucky, the summer cicadas humming outside, I think about the strange beauty of vengeance. People assume it tastes like fire, sharp and quick. But for me, it was cool, deliberate, patient as the turning of seasons. A slow frost, creeping in until everything that needed to die withered on its own. And in the ashes of that revenge, something surprising bloomed: clarity. I no longer wonder if I mattered. I know I did. I mattered enough to be betrayed, enough to fight back, enough to force change. And in the end, I mattered enough to be remembered. When I go, when my time comes, Christopher will inherit part of my legacy. But he'll inherit something more valuable, the lesson in blood and memory that family is not replaceable, that a mother cannot be sidelined like an afterthought at a dinner party. And if one day he has children, maybe, just maybe, he'll remember what I taught him, not through lectures, but through the sharp, cold blade of revenge. Never forget the hands that raised you, because once they close, the world feels an awful lot colder.